Hi, everybody. So, I have two things I need to go over with you guys today, and I'm going to try to do it pretty quickly. Since I'm filming this on my laptop using a software that lets me film my screen, I have a time limit. So, I'm going to have to be quick with what I am talking about. So, the last week, you guys really didn't have any new material. I just went and asked you to look back at some of the discussion posts or quizzes that you might have missed. And here's why. So I'm going to put the essay 1 prompt on the screen. So what you're looking at here is your first formal writing assignment for this class. Now, it's not due for a little bit. I think it's due, I have it written down right here. It's not due until the 7th of October. So it's like 3 more weeks before this is due. So we have 3 more class periods, or at least 2 more, to talk about writing before it's due. So it's a while from now. But with that being said, I do want you to know what's coming ahead so that you'll understand why we're doing the things we're doing now. So just briefly take a glance at this. What I want you to see is that the assignment is going to reflect on your ideas about the South, which is where we started the class, and look at how S-Town and Sweet Home Alabama compare or differ. You're going to pick one of the tropes that I have listed there, and I've explained what I want you to do in an intro with body paragraphs and moving on to the conclusion as well. It's a 750-page paper, which is pretty short, and when you complete the essay building assignments like I ask you to do, it will basically build the paper for you. That's why I call them essay building. So, no need to worry too much. You've got lots of time to get this stuff ready. And like I said, the essay building will help. Now, that being said, I do want to make sure that we are all kind of sort of developing our understanding still of the 2 primary texts that we've watched. So I actually made this PowerPoint here. I'm going to move myself out of the way a little bit. Right there, maybe. To just go over some of the major ideas that I think are present in these 2 texts. Now, we've already spent 2 class periods talking about them. You've filled out some discussion posts. I just want to respond to some of the stuff that you guys have said and some of the ways that I myself really think about these 2 texts. So let's start by talking about S-Town since you guys read that first or you viewed it. So just to be clear, someone in class, I think, asked if this was a true story. And yes, it is. This podcast features an interview, essentially, that was conducted by a man named Brian Reed and John B. McLemore. John B. was from Woodstock, Alabama. He called Brian to ask him to help him investigate this unsolved murder. Turns out there really wasn't as much to go on with this unsolved murder that John B. had hoped, but the podcast still exists and becomes quite famous too. I think it has 6 episodes too, so it develops beyond the initial concern. In class, we talked a lot about John B., and in your discussion post, I asked you to think about why he didn't like the South and why he didn't leave, those 2 things. So we kind of did a character analysis of him, but I want us to think a little bit less about John B. and a little bit more about Brian Reed, who is the interviewer, who is the person who produced and created this podcast. And I want us to kind of think a little bit about how he represents John B. and how he represents the South. So I've got 2 pictures here, and gosh, the contrast is just stark, right? I've got Brian Reed on the left, and this is actually a picture of John B. on the right. So very different men. Like I said, it deviates well away from its original point about this unsolved murder and becomes really just a sort of memoir about John B. McLemore. So I'm going to move myself down here for now. So we find out again that there is this disillusionment due to police brutality, anti-intellectualism, and he tells Brian Reed, who is from New York, which is not the South at all, he tells him, "We really need people like you to come down to this pathetic little Baptist shit town and blow it off the map." Super cynical. And sort of looking for people who are not Southern to come and change or destroy what he thinks is really negative about being in the South. We can definitely see this as a very cynical man. And, it's really kind of hard to think about, like I said, how to get into John B.'s mind because he's such a character and, he's a real person. It's hard to understand exactly where he was coming from. But we do, and also he didn't really make this podcast. Brian Reed is the person who made it. So we have to think about Brian Reed as the author. And in doing that, we can consider what he included, what he highlighted, featured, showed in his podcast to help us think about John B. and the South. In other words, what was Brian trying to get us to think about the South? What was his point of view? So I included here some quotes, and this is, I'm sorry about my screen. It doesn't want to show the whole PowerPoint. There we go. So I've got some quotes here. These are some quotes from John B., and these are, I think, mostly all from the first episode. He said, "I'm in an area that just hasn't advanced, for a lack of a better word. I should have gotten out of this bleepity bleep bleep shit town in my 20s. He says, I should have done something useful. But we talked about this in class. He loves his home. He loves his life. His dad and his grandfather own that property, right? He also talks about how he's gotten himself into a prison of his own making. He talks about how different he was from kids in school. Kids were talking about getting girls or deer hunting or football, whereas I was interested in the astrolabe. I don't know what that is. Honestly, sundials, projective geometry, I don't know what that is either. You know, like, he's interested in these intellectual things that other people don't really have, you know, much time for. And also, we do find out later that he's not interested or attracted to girls, he is attracted to men. So that definitely separates him from what might be ordinarily perceived as norm or normal. So he just feels ostracized. He represents the South if your question is, how does John B. represent the South? Bad. Horrible. But let's compare that to Brian Reed. I gotta move my screen again. I'm so sorry about that. This wants to cut it off for some reason. Okay, so I'm interested in how Brian Reed represents John B. The quote that I have right here at the top is where John B. is talking about something called proleptic decay and decrepitude. He said, my hometown is filled with this. And Brian Reed says, you know, I'm not ashamed to say that I had to look up this word. He tries to, I think, seem as if he respects John B. Even though John B. is from the South and Brian Reed is from the North, in some ways, he defers to John B. He's like, well, this is your town. What do you think about this town? When he's investigating in the courthouse, he tells John B. to go in because he's like, this is really your place. So I think he shows a lot of respect for him. Brian Reed shows a lot of respect for John B. But he does point out that John B. is different. He says when he visits John B.'s house, the whole place feels like it's from another time. And then he says it literally is because John B. doesn't follow daylight savings time. So while he's respectful, he does point out the differences. Now, what I also want us to think about is, how does Brian Reed represent not John B. as a Southerner, but the other people he encounters when he is in Woodstock? So I have a lot of quotes right here, and I know this is way more quotes than you should ever have on a PowerPoint. Trust me, I know those rules. But I need you to see them. So he talks about when he goes, and this is episode 2, he goes to that tattoo parlor. He talks about feeling uncomfortable and participating in some illegal behavior so that he fits in. He says, I don't want to seem like a narc, so I pretend to take a puff. So he does point out that he's a little bit different than these characters that he's spending time with. He does mention, too, that there's this fella named Bubba who displays, and this is in the middle, a fluent knowledge of the differences between the various white supremacy groups. And then from there, this is the most damning moment. He talks about how he has a black girlfriend whose family is from the South, and she had insisted that he make his Facebook and Instagram private because there are pictures of them together. And he thought, as someone from New York, that's crazy. Who would care? But when he started hanging out with these guys at the tattoo parlor, he goes, well, I'm grateful that I followed her advice. He also makes the case here that when someone asks me what the women look like in New York, I tell them they're all shapes, sizes, and colors. When someone asks what my ethnicity is, I tell them the Italian part without mentioning the Russian Jew part. So he feels as if he might be discriminated against based on some of the things that these guys are saying in the tattoo parlor. This is a negative representation of these guys. Now, he's not mean about them. He's respectful, I think, to some degree, in his highlighting and featuring that scene in the tattoo parlor. And it's really funny, too. Isn't Bubba the guy who has, like, "Feed Me" tattooed on his belly? It's kind of funny. But at the same time, you know, he's like, these guys are a little rough. And it shows what exactly John B. is so upset by. This kind of discrimination, I think. That, and maybe even sexism, too, to talk about what do the women look like in New York. I mean, the last I checked, this is America, and, you know, women pretty much look, I mean, in the world, women, gosh, that's just a strange question to ask. So, and it's a little bit objectifying. So he does, I think, take the time, Brian Reed, to show some issues in the South. Now, let's compare that to Sweet Home Alabama, which I would argue shows almost no issues with the South, but only reinforces the positive. This is the exact opposite of a narrative. Now, Melanie, she leaves her hometown for some different reasons. She's upset that her family doesn't have a lot of money. She tries to pretend to the reporters when they come investigating to try to find out more about her that her family lives in that big plantation, that old estate. So this is a very different scenario. She doesn't not like the South because they're discriminatory. She, in this film, doesn't like it because she doesn't make enough money to be seen as wealthy or prestigious. That's a little strange. What motivates her to come back? I know everyone in the discussion post is like, she loves him, Jake. And maybe she does as a character. But also, she can come back to an empire. He's created a company that's successful. She comes back. I don't think she would have came back if he didn't make a name for himself. She wants that class status, and she gets it when she leaves and motivates him to do something. Like if he had just been like working an everyday 9-to-5 job, I don't think she would have been as appealed. Her motivation is class in a lot of ways. This is pointing back to this idea of the Southern Belle. So in the antebellum area, women, and this is like, I'm not making this up, this is history, and we can look at this more as the class goes on, but we talked about this a little in class, that a Southern belle, you see this dress, this is the typical fashion, but they're characterized by this hospitality, this beauty, flirty, but demure and pure for sure. And the point of a Southern belle is to marry a rich young man. That's the point, because we're talking about 1860s. We're not talking about a moment where women had an opportunity to work or vote even, where this was the time that people were like, you can't be anything except for a wife and a mom. And now we know, like, being a wife and a mom is great, but sometimes women like to do other things besides that, and that's great too. But the antebellum era in history was not progressive at all. And what a film like Sweet Home Alabama risks is not critiquing that moment in history, but instead reinforcing it. At the end of our film, she goes back to marry Jake. We don't even know what happened to her job, and I asked you guys that, and a lot of people were like, oh, well, I guess she just forgot about it. Really? You forget about a career that you moved to New York to do that's in fashion, you're high profile, and you just let it go? For someone who you haven't even talked to in 10 years or however long, it didn't seem like you missed him very much, it's a little bit unbelievable in some ways. It's a fairy tale. I mean, I think I have a picture from the end here. Yeah, when she was a little kid, she said, what would I want to marry you for? I have too much to live for. But that totally changes, and the film reinforces this idea that she'll just be happier if she gives up, that ambition and drive and for this perceived love. And I'm not saying that, love is great, that's fine. But what we risk here, like I said, is reinforcing old ideas instead of critiquing them. I also believe that this film reinforces the idea that the South is better than the North. And this is my previous slide. I'm kind of out of order. Sorry about that. But in this film, the people who are rude are these folks. I can't remember her name or his name. It's all left my mind. But they are snobby, they're Democrats, God forbid, and they're rude about how Melanie's house is not very nice. At least the mother-in-law is. Like, they're the stereotypical rude Yankees. But in Sweet Home Alabama, we remember this young man who Melanie outs in front of everybody. He ends up being accepted. They're like, we don't care that you're gay. You know, you can still be here, which is the opposite of what John B. said about his experience in the South. So, two very distinct representations here. I'm out of time on my video, but that's basically all I wanted to say about this in particular. Please let me know if you have questions, and I'll add the discussion post to the bottom of this